The mail-order bride advertisement trembled in Xander Zimmerman's calloused hands as he stood outside the general store in Silver Peak, Nevada, knowing that placing his name on that paper would change everything about his solitary existence in the mountains above town. It was 1882, and Xander had spent the last 8 years of his life alone in a cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, high in the rocky peaks that gave the town its name. At 28 years old, he was a man carved from the wilderness itself, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk down the mountainside. His dark hair fell past his collar, often tied back with a leather cord when he worked, and his arms were thick with muscle earned from splitting wood, hauling stone, and surviving in a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak. His face was rugged, weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen too many empty evenings watching the sun set over an empty valley. He had come to Nevada from Missouri after his parents died of fever, seeking solitude and a fresh start away from the memories that haunted every corner of his childhood home. The mountains had given him peace, given him purpose, but lately the silence had begun to feel less like tranquility and more like a slow starvation of the soul. He would sit by his fire at night, listening to the wind howl through the pines, and wonder what it might be like to hear a woman's laughter echo through his cabin, to wake up to someone other than his own reflection in the tin mirror by the wash basin. The advertisement had been posted by a matrimonial agency back east, listing women seeking husbands in the Western Territories. Xander had read it 3 times before finally pulling out a stub of pencil and a piece of paper from his saddlebag. His handwriting was rough but legible as he composed his letter, describing his property, his means of living through trapping and occasional work in the silver mines below, and his desire for a wife who would not mind the isolation of mountain life. He did not mention that he had not spoken to another human being for more than a few minutes at a time in over a month, or that sometimes he feared he was forgetting how to carry on a proper conversation. 3 months passed before he received a response. The letter came to the general store in Silver Peak, where the postmaster held it for 2 weeks before Xander made one of his infrequent trips down the mountain for supplies. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting inside neat and precise. Her name was Eleanor Brennan, and she was 23 years old, writing from Philadelphia, where she had been working as a seamstress since her father's death left her and her younger sister without means. Her sister had recently married, and Eleanor found herself alone in a boarding house, facing a future of endless needlework and diminishing prospects. She wrote with surprising candor about her situation, about her fear of becoming invisible in a city that had no use for unmarried women past a certain age, about her willingness to travel west for a chance at a different kind of life. But it was the final paragraph that made Xander read the letter a 4th and 5th time. She wrote that she had only one requirement, one rule that she would need him to honor if they were to marry. She would explain it when she arrived, but she needed his word that he would respect her wishes, whatever they might be, for at least the first 3 months of their marriage. It was an unusual request, strange enough that Xander nearly crumpled the letter and tossed it into the stove that evening. But something about her words, about the quiet desperation he sensed between the lines, made him reconsider. He was not a man who made promises lightly, but he was also not a man with many options. The few unmarried women in Silver Peak were either too young or already spoken for, and he had no desire to court the saloon girls who worked in the establishments down by the mining operations. He wanted a wife, a partner, someone to build a life within the wild beauty of the mountains he loved. He wrote back agreeing to her terms, though he had no idea what he was agreeing to. He sent money for her passage and told her he would meet her at the train station in Carson City on the 15th of September. Then he spent the next 6 weeks cleaning his cabin with a thoroughness that would have amazed anyone who knew him, building a proper bed frame to replace the simple cot he had been sleeping on, and constructing a privacy screen in one corner of the single large room that served as his kitchen, dining area, and living space combined. The day he rode down to Carson City, the aspens were beginning to turn gold in the high country, and the air had that sharp clarity that only comes in early autumn in the mountains. He had bathed in the cold stream behind his cabin, trimmed his beard, and put on his best shirt, a dark blue flannel that his mother had made for him before she died. He felt ridiculous and nervous, like a boy going to his first dance, and he kept checking the pocket watch that had belonged to his father to see if he was going to be late. The train was on time, pulling into the station with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes. Xander stood on the platform, his hat in his hands, watching as passengers began to disembark. He saw businessmen in suits, families with crying children, miners heading to the various camps scattered throughout the territory. Then he saw her. Eleanor Brennan stepped down from the train car with a carpetbag in one hand, and a small trunk being hauled down by a porter behind her. She was smaller than he had imagined, barely reaching his shoulder, with auburn hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet and a traveling dress of dark green that had seen better days. Her face was pale from the long journey, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and perhaps fear. But when she looked around the platform and her gaze found his, something flickered in those green eyes that might have been relief or determination or both. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Miss Brennan," she nodded, studying him with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of his size, of how rough he must look compared to the city men she was used to. "Mr. Zimmerman, Xander, please." He gestured toward her trunk. "May I?" "Thank you." Her voice was soft but steady, with a faint Eastern accent that would take time to fade. They loaded her belongings onto his pack horse, and he helped her mount the mare he had brought for her to ride. She was not an experienced horsewoman, but she did not complain as they began the long journey back to Silver Peak. They rode in near silence for the first hour, the awkwardness between them thick as fog. Xander tried several times to start a conversation, asking about her journey and whether she had eaten, but her answers were brief, and he soon gave up, letting the sound of hoofbeats fill the space between them. It was late afternoon when they finally reached his cabin, the sun already beginning to slip behind the western peaks. Eleanor dismounted stiffly, looking around at the clearing he had carved out of the wilderness. The cabin was solid, built from logs he had cut and hauled himself, with a stone chimney and a covered porch where he kept his wood stacked. Behind it, the forest rose up toward the bare rock of the mountain peaks, and in front, the land sloped down toward a meadow where a small stream cut through the grass. "It is remote," she said finally, and he could not tell if that was approval or concern in her voice. "Yes." He carried her trunk inside, setting it down near the privacy screen he had built. "The nearest neighbor is 5 miles down the valley. Town is about 2 hours' ride when the weather is good." She followed him inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. He watched as she took in the single room, the bed in one corner, the cookstove and table, the shelves lined with supplies, the rifle mounted above the door, the furs and hides stretched on frames near the back wall. It was clean and orderly, but it was unmistakably the home of a man who had lived alone for a very long time. "I built the screen for you," he said, feeling the need to fill the silence. "For privacy. I know it is not much, but I thought, it is fine." She turned to face him, and he saw that she was trembling slightly, though whether from cold or nerves he could not tell. "Mr. Zimmerman, we should speak plainly about our arrangement." "Xander," he corrected gently. "And yes, I suppose we should." She took a breath, straightening her shoulders in a way that reminded him of a soldier preparing for battle. "I agreed to come here as your wife, and I intend to honor that commitment. But I have one rule, as I mentioned in my letter. For the first 3 months of our marriage, we must sleep separately. You may not touch me in any intimate way during that time." The words hung in the air between them. Xander felt his face grow warm, and he turned away to poke unnecessarily at the fire in the stove. "I see." "I need time," she continued, her voice softer now. "Time to know you, to trust you. I realize this is not what most men would want in a marriage, and if you wish to send me back, I will understand. But this is my condition." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. He had wondered what her strange rule might be, had imagined everything from religious restrictions to some secret from her past. This was both simpler and more complicated than anything he had anticipated. He thought about the loneliness that had driven him to place that advertisement, about the hope that had sustained him through the summer as he prepared for her arrival. 3 months was a long time, but after 8 years alone, what was 3 more months? "All right," he said, turning back to face her. "I gave you my word that I would respect your wishes, and I will. 3 months. But Eleanor, I expect you to be honest with me during that time. If something troubles you, if you need something, I need to know." The relief on her face was immediate and unmistakable. "Thank you. We should marry as soon as possible," he added. "I will take you down to Silver Peak tomorrow. There is a preacher there who can perform the ceremony, unless you want to wait." "No," she said quickly. "Tomorrow is fine." That night, he gave her the bed and made himself a pallet on the floor near the stove. He lay awake long after he heard her breathing slow into the rhythm of sleep, staring at the ceiling beams he had hewn himself, and wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had expected a marriage of convenience, certainly, had not imagined that love would bloom immediately between 2 strangers brought together by necessity. But he had hoped for companionship, for warmth, for the simple comfort of another human presence. Now he had a wife who would not let him touch her, sleeping 10 feet away from him in the darkness, and he had no idea how to bridge that distance. They were married the next day in a brief ceremony at the church in Silver Peak, with the preacher's wife and the general store owner serving as witnesses. Eleanor wore the same green dress she had traveled in, and Xander wore his cleanest shirt and pants, his hair still damp from washing in the stream that morning. The preacher seemed unconcerned by the hasty nature of the wedding, having performed dozens of similar ceremonies for mail-order brides and minors who needed wives to legitimize their claims or simply to survive the harsh winters. When it was done, they were husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law, though Xander felt no different as they rode back up to the cabin. Eleanor was quiet again, her face unreadable beneath the bonnet she wore against the autumn sun. He wanted to ask what she was thinking, whether she regretted her decision, but the words stuck in his throat. The first week passed in a kind of awkward dance as they learned to live together in the small space of the cabin. Xander rose before dawn as he always had, building up the fire and putting on coffee before heading out to check his trap lines or chop wood. Eleanor would be awake by the time he returned, usually with some simple breakfast prepared, and they would eat together in near silence. She spent her days cleaning, organizing, and mending his worn clothing with the skill of the seamstress she had been. He spent his days working, always conscious of her presence in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. At night, he continued to sleep on the floor despite her protests that she could make do with a pallet herself. He refused to hear of it, insisting that he had given her his word that she would have privacy and space, and he would not go back on that promise. Sometimes he would wake in the darkness and hear her crying softly, and he would lie there wondering whether he should go to her or whether that would violate the terms of their agreement. It was during the second week that they had their first real conversation. He had come back to the cabin in late afternoon, dirty and exhausted from hauling stones to repair a section of the stream bank that had washed out in a recent rain. Eleanor had hot water ready for him to wash, and she had made a stew that filled the cabin with the rich scent of venison and root vegetables. "You are a good cook," he said as they ate, and was rewarded with a small smile. "My mother taught me." She said a woman who could not feed her family was no use to anyone. "Tell me about her." He leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee mug. "Your family." And so she did, slowly at first and then with growing ease. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her father who had been a clerk in a shipping office and her mother who had taken in sewing to make ends meet. She told him about her younger sister Margaret, who had always been the pretty one, the charming one, and who had married a banker's son the previous spring. She told him about the cramped apartment they had lived in, about the endless gray of the city, about the feeling of being slowly smothered by the weight of expectations and limited choices. In return, he told her about Missouri, about the farm his parents had worked until the fever came and took them within days of each other. He told her about coming west, about learning to trap and hunt and survive in the mountains, about the harsh beauty of winter storms and the peace of watching elk graze in the meadow below his cabin. He told her about the loneliness, though he did not use that word, speaking instead of quiet evenings and long days without seeing another soul. "You not miss people?" she asked. "Conversation, company?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but people can be cruel. The mountains are harsh, but they are honest. They do not pretend to be something they are not." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Someone hurt you." It was not a question, and he found himself nodding. "A woman back in Missouri, before my parents died. I thought we would marry, but she chose someone else, someone with more money, better prospects. I am sorry. It was a long time ago." He stood, carrying his dishes to the wash basin. "She made the right choice for her. I could not have given her what she wanted." "What did she want?" "Things. A big house, fine dresses, a place in society. I wanted land, open sky, freedom." He shrugged. "We were not suited." Eleanor rose and came to stand beside him, taking the dishes from his hands and setting them in the basin to wash. "And what do you want from me?" The question caught him off guard. He looked down at her, at the way the firelight caught the red tones in her hair, at the serious set of her mouth. "Honestly, I do not know any more. When I sent for a wife, I thought I wanted someone to cook and clean, to share the work of living. But now that you are here, I find I want more than that." "What more?" "A partner, a friend, someone who chooses to be here, not because they have no other options, but because they want to be." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something like warmth in her eyes. "That is what I want too. But Xander, I need you to understand why I asked for time. You do not have to explain, I do." She dried her hands on a towel, her movements precise and controlled. "In Philadelphia, after my father died, I worked in a garment factory. The owner was a man who thought that the women who worked for him owed him more than just their labor. He cornered me one day, tried to force himself on me. I fought him off and fled, but I lost my position. That is why I was doing piecework in my room at the boarding house. I could not risk working for another man like that. Xander felt anger surge through him, hot and fierce. Did you report him? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. To whom? The police. They would have asked what I did to encourage him. My sister's husband said I must have misunderstood his intentions, that I was being dramatic. No one believed me. I believe you. The words came out rougher than he intended, but he meant them. Eleanor, I need you to know that I would never force you to anything. Not in 3 months, not ever. She searched his face, and he forced himself to stand still under her scrutiny, to let her see the truth in his eyes. Finally, she nodded. I know. I think I knew from the moment I saw you at the train station. But I needed the time anyway, needed to feel like I had some control over my own life again. Then you have it, he said. 3 months and not a day less. And after that, only what you choose to give. Something shifted between them in that moment, some invisible wall crumbling just a little. That night, when he lay down on his pallet by the stove, he felt less like an intruder in his own home and more like a man with a future that might contain more than just solitude and survival. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened into late October, and the work of preparing for winter intensified. Xander spent long hours hunting, smoking meat, and stacking firewood, building up the supplies that would see them through the months when the snow would make travel impossible. Eleanor proved to be a quick learner, asking questions about everything from skinning rabbits to rendering bear fat for cooking. She was not squeamish, he discovered, and she had a practical turn of mind that served her well in the harsh realities of mountain living. They fell into a routine that was almost comfortable. He would wake early and start the fire, and she would rise soon after to make breakfast. They would work together on whatever tasks the day required, speaking more freely now about small things, safe things. He learned that she loved to read, but had left most of her books behind in Philadelphia. He rode down to Silver Peak the next week and came back with 3 novels borrowed from the preacher's wife, and the look of joy on Eleanor's face when he handed them to her made the long journey worthwhile. She learned that he had a talent for carving, that the reason his cabin had such beautiful detail work on the mantel and door frames was because he spent his winter evenings working wood with patient skill. She asked if he would teach her, and they began to spend their evenings sitting by the fire, his large hands guiding her smaller ones as she learned to follow the grain and work with the knife rather than against it. It was during one of these evenings, nearly 6 weeks into their marriage, that Eleanor first laughed at something he said. He had been telling her about the time he had tried to domesticate a raccoon, and ended up with his entire food supply scattered across the cabin floor and claw marks on both arms. The sound of her laughter, bright and genuine, filled the cabin like music, and he found himself smiling in response, hungry for more of that sound. After that, the laughter came more easily. He discovered that she had a sharp wit and a talent for dry observations that caught him off guard and made him grin. She discovered that, beneath his serious exterior, was a man who noticed small beauties, who would point out the way frost formed perfect crystals on spider webs, or how the light turned the mountains purple at sunset. November brought the first serious snow, a storm that dropped 3 feet in 2 days and left them truly isolated. Xander had been through many winters alone, but having Eleanor there made everything different. The cabin felt smaller with 2 people in it, but also warmer, more alive. They played cards by lamplight, using dried beans for stakes, and she proved to be a ruthless poker player who took satisfaction in his defeat. They cooked together, creating elaborate meals from their limited supplies, and he was amazed at how she could turn salt pork and dried apples into something that tasted like a feast. One morning he woke to find her standing at the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow fall. He rose quietly and came to stand beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I used to hate winter," she said softly. "In the city it just meant more cold, more darkness, more struggle. But here it is beautiful. It can be deadly too," he warned. "Never go out in a storm, even if you think you know the way. Men have frozen to death 20 feet from their own doors because they could not find them in a whiteout." She turned to look at him. "You worry about me. Of course I do. You are my wife, in name only." He met her gaze steadily. "Does that matter? You are still my responsibility, my partner. Your safety matters to me, Eleanor, more than I expected it to." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I worry about you too. When you are out checking the traps and the wind picks up, I stand at that window and watch for you to come back." Something warm unfurled in his chest at her words. "I always come back. Promise me you always will. I promise." December arrived, and with it came the realization that their 3-month agreement was approaching its end. Xander found himself both eager for and anxious about what would come next. In the past weeks, they had grown close in ways that had nothing to do with physical intimacy. He knew how she liked her coffee, how she hummed when she was concentrating on her sewing, how she would fall asleep reading by the fire, and he would gently take the book from her hands and bank the flames before waking her to go to bed. She knew that he was restless in the hour before dawn, that he preferred silence in the early morning, that he had nightmares sometimes about his parents' death, and would wake rigid with grief that he refused to speak about. But they had not touched beyond the occasional brush of hands when passing something between them, had not breached the careful distance that Eleanor's rule had established. Sometimes Xander would catch her watching him with an expression he could not quite read, and he would wonder what she was thinking, whether she felt the same growing pull that he did. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when everything changed. Xander had been out hunting, tracking a deer through the deep snow, and had stayed out longer than he intended, wanting to bring back fresh meat. By the time he returned to the cabin, it was full dark and Eleanor was standing on the porch, her face tight with worry in the light of the lantern she held. "You were gone so long," she said as he dismounted, and he heard the tremor in her voice. "I thought something had happened. I am fine. I got the deer, see?" He gestured to the carcass draped over his pack horse. "It just took longer to field dress than I expected." She set the lantern down and came down the steps, and he saw that she was shaking. Before he could ask what was wrong, she threw her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. He stood frozen for a moment, shocked by the sudden contact, then slowly brought his arms up to hold her, feeling how small she was against him, how fragile despite her strength. "Eleanor." "I was so scared," she whispered. "The sun went down and you did not come back, and I kept imagining you lying hurt somewhere in the snow, and I realized that I could not bear it. I could not bear to lose you." He tightened his arms around her, resting his cheek against the top of her head. "I am here. I am all right." She pulled back enough to look up at him, and in the lamplight he could see tears on her cheeks. "Xander, I do not want to wait any more. I do not need the rest of the time. I trust you. I want this to be a real marriage." His heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel pressured. I am certain." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers cold against his skin. "These past months, you have been kinder to me than anyone I have ever known. You have been patient and gentle, and you have made me feel safe. I do not just want a partner or a friend, Xander. I want a husband. I want you." He searched her eyes, looking for any hint of doubt or fear, but found only certainty and something that looked like the same longing he felt. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. Her lips were soft and cold from the winter air, and she made a small sound that might have been surprise or relief or both. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "We should go inside," he said, his voice rough. "You are freezing." "I do not care." But he did, so he led her back into the cabin, his arm around her shoulders, feeling like a man who had been lost in the wilderness and had finally found his way home. That night, when she came to his pallet by the stove and took his hand to lead him to the bed, he followed her with a heart so full he could barely breathe. Making love to Eleanor was nothing like he had imagined during the long weeks of waiting. It was tender and awkward and sweet, both of them fumbling in the darkness like the inexperienced people they were. But it was also right in a way that transcended physical pleasure, a joining that made him feel connected to another human being in a way he had thought lost to him forever. Afterward, she lay curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, and he traced patterns on her back with his fingers and marveled at how his life had changed. "I love you," he said into the darkness, the words escaping before he could think better of them. She lifted her head to look at him. "What? I love you," he said it again, stronger this time. "I think I have loved you for weeks now, but I did not let myself believe it could be real. But it is, Eleanor, this is real." Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too." "I was so afraid to admit it, afraid that if I let myself feel it, something would go wrong. But I cannot help it. I love you, Xander." He pulled her close and kissed her again, tasting salt and joy and the promise of a future that had seemed impossible just a few short months ago. Christmas came, and Xander rode down to Silver Peak to buy supplies and pick up gifts he had ordered weeks before. He came back with a warm wool cloak for Eleanor, lined with rabbit fur he had tanned himself, and a set of books she had mentioned wanting to read. She gave him a new shirt she had sewn in secret, working on it while he was out during the day, and a carved wooden box for his tools that she had labored over with the skills he had taught her. They roasted a goose he had shot and made biscuits with precious white flour, and they ate their feast by candlelight while snow fell softly outside. "This is the best Christmas I have ever had," Eleanor said, and he knew from the look in her eyes that she meant it. "Mine too." January and February passed in a blur of cold and intimacy and growing love. Xander had never been a man given to poetry, but he found himself trying to find words for what he felt when he watched Eleanor baking bread, her face flushed from the heat of the oven, or when she would turn to him in bed and smile with a contentment that mirrored his own. She bloomed in the isolation of the mountain, becoming more confident and strong, her laughter ringing out more freely, her touch more certain. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their pasts and their dreams for the future. She told him that she wanted children someday, a whole cabin full of them to chase away the loneliness of the mountains. He told her that he wanted to expand their land, maybe build a larger cabin, perhaps even bring in a few cattle if they could find good grazing land. They made plans and shared hopes, and the winter that might have been endless in its isolation, instead, flew by like a beautiful dream. It was in March, when the snow was beginning to melt, and the first hints of spring were touching the high country, that Eleanor came to him with news that made his heart stop. She had been quieter than usual that morning, and when he asked what was troubling her, she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I am with child," she said simply. For a moment he could not speak, could not think, could only stare at her as the words sank in. Then joy exploded through him, so fierce and sudden that he let out a shout and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "You are happy?" she asked, though the answer was obvious in his face. "Happy, Eleanor, I am more than happy. I am amazed. I am blessed. I am going to be a father." She wrapped her arms around his neck. "You are going to be a wonderful father." The pregnancy progressed through the spring and into summer, and Xander found himself becoming even more protective than he had been before. He would not let Eleanor lift anything heavy, would not let her work too hard, hovering so constantly that she finally had to sit him down and explain that being pregnant did not make her an invalid. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she said, exasperated but amused. "I am not going to break. I know, but I cannot help it. You are carrying my child, Eleanor, the most precious thing in the world to me. I thought I was the most precious thing in the world to you. You are both the most precious thing." He knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his. "I never knew I could feel this much. Sometimes it terrifies me how much I love you, how much I need you." She leaned down to kiss him. "You do not need to be afraid. I am not going anywhere." As summer progressed, they prepared for the baby's arrival with the same practicality that they brought to all aspects of mountain living. Xander built a cradle from pine wood, carving it with intricate patterns of mountains and trees. While Eleanor sewed tiny clothes and blankets from fabric she had him bring up from Silver Peak. They discussed names endlessly, settling finally on Samuel if it was a boy, and Rose if it was a girl, after their respective parents. It was late September when Eleanor's labor began, almost exactly 1 year after she had arrived on that train in Carson City. Xander rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife from Silver Peak, a sturdy German woman named Frau Schultz, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. She took one look at Eleanor and sent Xander outside, telling him firmly that this was women's work and he would only be in the way. He spent the longest hours of his life pacing in front of his cabin, listening to Eleanor's cries through the walls and feeling more helpless than he ever had in his life. When dawn broke and he finally heard the thin wail of an infant, he burst through the door to find Frau Schultz cleaning a red-faced, angry little creature who was protesting his arrival into the world with impressive volume. "A boy," the midwife announced. "Strong and healthy. Your wife did well." Xander barely heard her, already crossing to the bed where Eleanor lay, pale and exhausted but smiling. "Are you all right?" "I am perfect." She held out her arms, and Frau Schultz placed the baby in them. "Look, Xander, look at our son." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, staring down at the tiny face, at the impossibly small fingers and the dark fuzz of hair on the perfectly round head. "Samuel," he whispered. "Samuel Zimmerman." Eleanor looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Our son." Xander reached out with one finger to touch the baby's hand, and impossibly, miraculously, the tiny fingers wrapped around his. In that moment, he felt something shift in his chest, some final piece of himself clicking into place. He had been alone for so long, had thought that solitude was his natural state. But now, looking at his wife and his child, he understood that he had just been waiting for them to find him, to make him whole. The first months of fatherhood were harder than anything Xander had ever done. Samuel was a colicky baby who cried often and slept little, and both he and Eleanor stumbled through their days exhausted and overwhelmed. But there were moments of pure joy too. The first time Samuel smiled at him, the way the baby would quiet when Xander held him against his chest, the sight of Eleanor nursing their son by firelight while humming a lullaby her mother had taught her. As Samuel grew, he became the center of their world. Xander would take him outside bundled in furs, showing him the mountains and the forest, talking to him about the animals and the trees even though the baby could not understand. Eleanor would sit and watch them with a contentment that made her glow, and at night when Samuel finally slept, they would lie together in the darkness and marvel at what they had created. "Do you ever regret it?" Xander asked one night. "Coming here, marrying a stranger, giving up the life you knew?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "Never. That life was not really living, Xander. It was just existing day after day, waiting for something that was never going to come. Here I am alive. I am a wife, a mother, a partner in something real. How could I regret that? I am glad. He pulled her closer. Because I cannot imagine my life without you now. You and Samuel, you are everything. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing family. When Samuel was 2, Eleanor became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose as they had planned. 2 years after that came another son, James, and then finally a second daughter, Grace. The cabin that had once seemed adequate for one man alone grew crowded with life and noise and love. Xander built an addition, expanding the single room into a proper house with separate bedrooms and a larger kitchen. He cleared more land, bringing in chickens and a milk cow, building a barn and a root cellar. The lonely mountain man who had placed an advertisement for a wife was gone, replaced by a husband and father who woke each day grateful for the chaos and joy of his full life. Samuel grew into a serious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to trap and hunt and raid the weather. Rose was wild and fearless, climbing trees and catching snakes, and declaring that she would be a mountain woman just like her mother. James was quiet and thoughtful, always building things or taking them apart to see how they worked. Grace was the baby, sweet-natured and affectionate, who could wrap both her parents around her tiny finger with a single smile. Eleanor flourished in her role as mother and wife, her initial fragility replaced by a strength that came from years of hard work and the knowledge that she was valued and loved. She taught the children to read using the books that now lined an entire wall of the cabin, books that Xander brought back from his increasingly rare trips to Silver Peak. She tended their vegetable garden, preserved food for winter, sewed clothes, and somehow found time to still share quiet moments with Xander when the children were asleep. "You remember your rule?" Xander asked her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were in bed, and for once the house was quiet. 3 months of no touching, Eleanor laughed, the sound rich and warm. "How could I forget? I was so frightened of you then, so sure that I had made a terrible mistake. And now look at us. 4 children, a life I never dreamed possible." "I thought you were strange," he admitted. "I thought maybe I had made a terrible mistake too, but that rule, as odd as it was, it gave us time to fall in love before anything else got in the way. It was the smartest thing I ever did." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "That and getting on that train to come west. I am glad you did. I am glad you took a chance on a lonely mountain man who barely knew how to talk to people anymore. You knew how to talk to me. That was all that mattered." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. After all these years, Xander still sometimes had moments where he would look around at his life and feel amazed that it was real. The loneliness that had driven him to seek a wife seemed like something from another lifetime, something that had happened to a different person. As the children grew older, they needed more than just the mountain for their education and socialization. Xander and Eleanor made the difficult decision to send Samuel and Rose to school in Silver Peak during the winter months, boarding them with the preacher and his wife. It was hard to let them go, to have the cabin suddenly feel too quiet again, but they both knew it was necessary. The world was changing, even in the remote mountains of Nevada, and they wanted their children to have opportunities they had never had. Samuel, at 16, talked about becoming a surveyor, about mapping the wilderness that he loved. Rose, at 14, declared that she wanted to be a teacher, to bring education to the scattered settlements throughout the territory. James and Grace were still young enough to be home, still wild and unshaped, still fully theirs for a few more years. One evening in late autumn, when Samuel and Rose had just returned from school for the winter break, the whole family gathered around the table for dinner. It was venison stew, the same meal Eleanor had made on Xander's second week in the cabin all those years ago. And as he looked around at the faces of his children, at his wife serving food with the same graceful economy of motion she had always had, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Papa, why are you crying?" Grace asked, her young face concerned. "I am not crying," he said, but his voice was rough and his eyes were definitely wet. "I am just happy." Eleanor met his gaze across the table, and her smile said she understood. She had given him this, had taken the enormous risk of traveling across the country to marry a stranger. And in return he had given her safety and love and a house full of children, who would never know the kind of fear and desperation that had driven her west. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they lay together in the darkness of their room, and Eleanor traced the lines of his face with her fingers. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how different my life would be if you had not come. If you had chosen to stay in Philadelphia, or if you had been too afraid to take the chance." "I was afraid. I was terrified, but I was more afraid of what would happen if I stayed, if I let my life continue to shrink down to nothing." "Your rule saved us," he said. "It gave us the foundation for everything that came after. If we had rushed into intimacy without trust, without friendship, we might have never found this." She kissed him softly. "I think we would have found our way, but I am glad we did it the way we did. I am glad I had the courage to ask for what I needed and that you had the patience to give it to me. I would have waited forever for you, liar." But she was smiling. "You were counting the days, admit it." "Maybe," he conceded, "but I would have waited if you needed me to." "You were worth waiting for, Eleanor. You are worth everything." The years continued to roll by, bringing changes both small and large. Samuel left home to work for a surveying company in Carson City, coming back to visit when he could with stories of the expanding railroad and the towns springing up throughout the territory. Rose became engaged to a young teacher from Silver Peak, an earnest man named Daniel who treated her with the kind of respect and love that made Xander willing to give his blessing. James announced that he wanted to study engineering, and they began saving money to send him to school back east. Grace, still young, was content to stay home and help her mother, though they all knew that would change soon enough. Xander and Eleanor watched their children grow and leave with a mixture of pride and sorrow, their cabin gradually emptying out as it had once filled up. But they had each other, and after all these years, that was still enough. They had grown old together in the mountains, their hair turning gray, their bodies marked by the hard work of their life, but their love had only deepened with time. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Xander took Eleanor on a trip to Carson City, leaving James and Grace in charge of the homestead for a week. They stayed in a hotel, a luxury neither of them had experienced in years, and they walked through the growing town holding hands like young sweethearts. "You want to go back?" he asked as they stood looking at the mountains in the distance, the peaks where they had built their life. "To the city, to comfort and ease," Eleanor shook her head firmly. "Those mountains are my home now, our home. I would not trade it for anything." "Good," he kissed her temple, "because I cannot imagine living anywhere else. Not without you, not without the life we built there." They returned to find that James had repaired the barn roof that had been leaking and Grace had organized the entire root cellar. Their children were capable and strong, ready to make their own ways in the world, but they would always carry the mountains with them, would always remember the lessons learned in that isolated cabin. When Samuel married and had children of his own, he brought them to visit his parents in the mountains, letting them run wild in the meadow where he had played as a boy. Rose and Daniel settled in Silver Peak, where she taught school and he worked as the town clerk. But they came up to the cabin every month, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. James went east to school but wrote long letters about everything he was learning, about his plans to come back and help develop the infrastructure of the growing state. Grace, the baby, stayed longest, finally leaving at 20 to marry a rancher from the valley below. And through it all, Xander and Eleanor remained, the constants in the changing landscape of their family's life. They were grandparents now, with Samuel and Rose both producing children who called them Grammy and Pop, and who loved visiting the mountain cabin where their parents had grown up. On a spring morning in 1907, 25 years after Eleanor had stepped off that train in Carson City, Xander woke early as he always did and lay listening to Eleanor breathing beside him. She was 58 now, he was 63, and they had lived a lifetime together in these mountains. His body ached more than it used to, and Eleanor moved slower than she once had, but they were healthy and happy and deeply in love. He rose quietly and went outside to watch the sun rise, a ritual he had maintained for 4 decades. But this time, Eleanor came out to join him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cool morning air. "Could not sleep?" he asked, making room for her beside him on the bench he had built on the porch. "I did not want to miss this." She settled against his side, fitting perfectly in the curve of his arm as she always had. "How many more sunrises do we have left to watch together? We should not waste them sleeping." "Many more," he said firmly, though they both knew that was not something they could control. "Many, many more." They sat in silence, watching as the light touched the peaks and spread down into the valley, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. The cabin behind them held the memories of their life together, every beam and board infused with love and work and the passage of years. Their children were scattered now, living their own lives, but they would all come home eventually. They always did. "Do you regret anything?" Eleanor asked softly. No, he did not even have to think about it. "Not one single thing. You. Only that I wasted so much of my youth being afraid. But even that brought me here, so perhaps I do not regret it after all." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Your strange rule changed everything. It gave us time to know each other, to trust each other. It built the foundation for all of this. I was so scared that you would refuse, that you would send me back. But you did not. You kept your word and you showed me what it meant to be truly loved. You saved me," he said simply. "I was dying up here, slowly turning into stone, and you brought me back to life." The sun climbed higher, warming their faces, and in the distance they could hear the sounds of the forest waking up. An elk bugled somewhere down in the valley, and closer by a raven called out a greeting. The mountains were alive around them, as they had been for millennia, enduring and beautiful and utterly indifferent to the small human dramas played out in their shadow. But Xander and Eleanor had carved out their own small piece of that vastness, had built a life and a family and a love that would endure long after they were gone. Their children would remember, and their children's children would remember, the story of the lonely mountain man who bought a wife, and the brave woman who asked for 3 months of respect before she would give her heart. And in those 3 months, they had found something neither of them had been looking for, something more precious than all the silver in the Nevada mountains. They had found home in each other, had found that love could grow in the most unlikely places, given patience and kindness and the courage to be vulnerable. As they sat together on the porch, Xander thought about that young man who had stood outside the general store in Silver Peak, trembling as he signed his name to a mail-order bride advertisement. That man had been so lonely, so desperate for human connection that he had been willing to risk everything on a stranger. And that risk had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Eleanor looked up at him, her green eyes still as bright as they had been that first day at the train station. "For what?" "For taking a chance on me. For being brave enough to come west. For your strange rule that gave us time to fall in love properly. For our children, our life, everything." "Thank you." She reached up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for showing me that not all men are cruel, that love can be gentle and strong at the same time. Thank you for giving me a home." They kissed soft and sweet, a kiss that held 25 years of love and partnership and the promise of whatever time they had left. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying, but they were happy tears. "I love you," Xander said. "More now than ever. I love you too. Always." They stayed on the porch until the sun was fully up, holding each other and watching their mountains turn from shadow to brilliance. Behind them, the cabin that had sheltered their love stood solid and true, and ahead of them stretched days and months and hopefully years of continued companionship. Their story had not been simple or easy, but it had been theirs. From that moment of desperate hope, when Xander signed the advertisement, through Eleanor's journey west and her unusual request, through the awkward weeks of learning to live together and the night when she finally said she was ready, through babies and building and the endless cycle of seasons in the high country, they had written their story together. And it was a good story, Xander thought as he held his wife close. A story about loneliness transformed into love, about fear becoming trust, about two broken people finding wholeness in each other. It was a story about patience and respect and the kind of deep, abiding love that grows slowly, putting down roots that nothing can shake. The mail-order bride system had brought them together, but it was their own choices that had made them a true marriage. Eleanor's choice to ask for time, and Xander's choice to give it to her without question. Her choice to trust him with her past, and his choice to be worthy of that trust. Their choice, every single day, to love each other through the difficulties and celebrate the joys. As the morning warmed and they finally rose to start their day, Xander looked back at the porch one more time. He could almost see them all there, the ghosts of their younger selves and all the versions they had been over the years. The wary strangers who had spoken their vows in Silver Peak. The tentative friends who had learned to talk by firelight. The passionate lovers who had finally come together. The exhausted new parents. The proud grandparents they were now. All of those people had loved each other, each in their own way, each version building on the last until they had become the couple they were today. And through it all, Eleanor's strange rule had set the tone, had established that in their marriage, respect and consent would always come first, that neither of them would ever be forced to give more than they were ready to give. It was a lesson they had passed on to their children, and one that their children would pass on in turn. That love was not about possession or control, but about partnership and choice. That patience could be the greatest gift one person could give another. That sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was ask for what they needed, and the kindest thing was to give it without question. The years ahead would bring more changes. Grandchildren would grow and have children of their own. The mountains would remain eternal while Xander and Eleanor gradually aged and eventually returned to the earth they had worked. But their love story would live on, told and retold around family hearth fires, a testament to what was possible when two lonely people found each other against all odds. And it had all started with a trembling hand signing a paper, a woman brave enough to step off a train into the unknown, and a strange rule that had seemed like a barrier but had actually been the beginning of everything. 3 months of patience that had led to decades of love. As Xander went about his morning chores, feeding the chickens and checking the barn, he found himself smiling. The loneliness that had once defined him was just a distant memory now, replaced by the rich fullness of a life well lived. He had built something real and lasting, not just the physical structures of his homestead, but the intangible architecture of family and love. Eleanor called him in for breakfast, and he washed up at the pump, then headed inside to where she had set the table. Even now, after all these years, the sight of her moving around their kitchen made his heart swell. She was his wife, his partner, his best friend, the mother of his children and the grandmother of their grandchildren. She was everything he had never known he needed, and everything he could not live without. They ate together, talking about the day ahead and what needed to be done before winter came again. It was an ordinary conversation on an ordinary morning, the kind they had shared thousands of times. But Xander had learned long ago that it was these ordinary moments that made up a life, that the quiet dailiness of love was more precious than any grand gesture. After breakfast, they worked together in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first hard frost. Eleanor's hands were gnarled with age now, her back not as straight as it once was, but she was still beautiful to him. He saw in her face the young woman who had stepped off that train, but also all the years that had shaped her since, all the laughter and tears and ordinary days that had made her who she was. "What are you looking at?" she asked, catching him staring. "You, just you." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "After all these years, you would think you would have gotten tired of looking. Never. I will never get tired of looking at you, Eleanor. You are still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." She came over and kissed him, dirt-stained hands and all. Flatterer. Truth-teller. They finished their work and went inside to clean up, and Xander found himself thinking again about how different his life might have been if he had not seen that advertisement, if he had not found the courage to respond. If Eleanor had chosen a different man from the dozens who must have written to the matrimonial agency. If she had not made her strange request, or if he had refused it. So many small choices and chances that had led to this moment, to this life, to this love. It seemed almost miraculous when he thought about it, the delicate web of circumstance that had brought them together. But then again, perhaps it was not chance at all. Perhaps they had been meant to find each other, two lonely souls searching for something they could not name until they saw it reflected in each other's eyes. That evening, as the sun set and they prepared for bed, Xander held Eleanor close and breathed in the peace of their shared life. Tomorrow would bring new tasks and new moments, and they would face them together as they always had. The mountains would watch over them, silent and eternal, and their love would continue to grow and deepen with each passing day. He fell asleep with Eleanor in his arms, grateful beyond measure for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to him, and for the wisdom she had shown in asking for time to build trust before anything else. That time had been the foundation of everything, the bedrock upon which they had built a marriage that had lasted a quarter century and would last, God willing, many more years to come. The lonely mountain man had bought a wife, and her single strange rule had indeed changed his whole future. It had changed it from a slow slide into isolated bitterness to a life overflowing with love and family and purpose. It had taught him that sometimes the greatest strength is in patience, and the deepest love grows not from instant passion, but from careful cultivation of trust and respect. And as he drifted into sleep, Xander's last thought was a simple one, but it contained all the joy and gratitude of his transformed life. He thought, I am home. Finally, after all the wandering and loneliness and searching, I am home. Because home was not just the cabin he had built or the mountains he loved. Home was Eleanor, and it always had been, from the moment she stepped off that train and into his life. She was his home, his heart, his whole world, and he was hers. Two strangers who had taken a chance on each other and found something neither of them had dared to hope for. A love that would last a lifetime and echo through generations. The strange rule had changed everything, not by keeping them apart, but by giving them the time and space to come together in the right way, at the right pace, with the right foundation. It was the best decision Eleanor had ever made, and honoring it was the best decision Xander had ever made. Together, those decisions had created something beautiful and enduring, a love story that had started with loneliness and risk, but had bloomed into something that neither time nor hardship could diminish. And so their story ended not with an ending at all, but with a continuation, with the promise of more mornings watching the sunrise, more evenings by the fire, more ordinary, extraordinary days of simply being together. The lonely mountain man and his mail-order bride had found their happily ever after, not in spite of the obstacles they faced, but because of how they chose to face them together, with patience and kindness and unwavering love. Their children and grandchildren would carry their story forward, would tell it to their own children someday, and the legend of Eleanor's strange rule and Xander's patient love would become part of their family's history. But for now, in this moment, they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds and had built a life worth living together.